Well, in the midst of that, we're still looking for the benefits of the economic reforms, which we know has put the country or caused a lot of hardship to the people, and we saw them on the streets. Some are still on the streets. And even those who were not on the streets are still protesting. Well, let's speak now to someone who is very familiar with the numbers and like a bridge between the government and the governed. Yes, because that's what the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, the NESG, does mostly. Let's speak to the Chief Executive Officer of NESG now, Dr. Tayo Adeloju. He joins us from our Abuja studio. Dr. Adeloju, good afternoon. Good to have you in the studio.
Hi, Ini. It's great to always be here. And
Dr. Adeloju, we're searching, we have a searchlight, the benefits of the reforms that have been so applauded, especially by international institutions, IMF, World Bank, and that came with the administration of President Bola Tinubu. I wonder if you've seen it or is it close by?
Well, Ine, I think you and I have had these conversations in private. Our view as the NESG is that the macro reforms of President Tinubu that were triggered in May, June last year were of the nature where the wins by design are not short-term wins. You really have to calibrate an economy differently to see near wins from macro reforms like subsidy removal and unification of FX. Therefore, our prescription from day one was that those reforms had to be sequenced in a way that they were simultaneously supported with social investments, social protection, and labor reforms that were done on time. Unfortunately, whilst the macro pass-through risk of the twin reforms have created a cost of living crisis with accelerated inflation rates and a cost of doing business crisis with pass-through on large, small, medium and nano enterprises, especially in the areas of raw material, working capital, inventory cost and finance and logistics. Right? The cushioning effects of the counterpart reforms have been slow to catch up. And this is the fundamental reason why the pass-through risk is almost devastating. When you have macro reforms of the type we have unleashed, you must have in step the social protection reforms that kick in quickly. So some examples for social protection reforms that did not kick in quickly. We saw, for example, social investments that were halted because of credibility issues that have now been restarted, I think last month, and at just about at 1 million households compared to the 15 million targeted. That, for example, is coming very late. Of course, the result of that is that the macro pass-through risk on households and individual wallets, even for the most vulnerable, is significant. Then when you look at macro pass-through risks on business, for example, you still see market regulators of key sectors of the economy maintain a hawkish, discoordinated approach to market governance, further creating and tightening the cost of a business crisis on businesses. So I think that whilst the broad macro actions have been heralded, we still must see from government a recalibration of market regulatory governance where there is a better coordination of the regulations that come from sector regulators to the market in a manner that promotes productivity and market expansion rather than contraction. We still need to see social investments and protections for households and houses be transmitted in a transparent, efficient, and effective way. Mr. President on Sunday rolled out a range of interventions that he has mandated But when you see the transmission effect, of these big reforms, a lot of accountability, a lot of transparency is required for the wins to be visible to all. And I think that that's the bigger part of the problem. We must see institutions come together, understanding that if these cushioning effects don't kick into motion, then basically we have left Nigerians devastatingly exposed to some of the harshest conditions, both at a household, individual, and a business and market level. And that's why we call it a cost of doing business crisis and a cost of living crisis. So I think that's the first point to make, Ini.
Yeah, well, I hear you. I hear the issue of coordination among institutions, because, I mean, even as we speak, we preach ease of doing business. But, I mean, then you also have another arm of government or agency of government making it uneasy to do business. That's one. And I also hear you about the transparency, because the federal government came and told us they're sending trucks of rice to states, 40 trucks of rice to each state. I wonder where those are. We're hearing a lot of stories about that. Then we hear they're selling bags of rice, 50 kg bags of rice at 40,000 naira to civil servants. And then we hear the civil servants turn around and sell it for about 80,000 naira or something like that. So I wonder what really we're missing. How do they do it in other countries? Because now people are saying we don't want palliatives anymore. But I mean, if we're talking about a social security system to help cushion the effect, where do we go? As you said, the president ruled out a whole lot of interventions, but impacts is so hard to measure or capture.
Here's the truth. Mr. President needs a mandate that he's seeing greater levels of accountability and performance reviews at his level. And there has to be sanctions for things that do not happen, right? The truth is, deploying bags of rice, palliatives, social investments is hard work, right? But when the president makes a mandate, for example, mandates he issued last year, 75 billion for manufacturers, 125 billion for micro, nano, and small enterprises, etc. When he mandates 500,000 hectares of land to be cultivated, what needs to happen is that targets based on these declarations have to be set, okay? And civil society can play a big role in participatory monitoring and evaluation and tracking of government interventions. And if the government allows civil society in, we non-state actors can do a better job in providing active feedback as to how many manufacturers got the 75 billion, how many nano entrepreneurs have gotten the 125 billion dollars, how many states have gotten the rights, how far has it gone, how is it going. We are in a democracy, so participatory monitoring and evaluation frameworks is crucial. And we have to work together to make this happen. And I think that our government colleagues and actors and partners need to understand that to co-create social outcomes, they can't do it by themselves. So, for example, a rice distribution should have had a model, a framework where the accountability, monitoring, and reporting mechanism is in place. The dashboards on distribution on a daily, weekly basis should be available, right? And so we know the citizens that got and the citizens that didn't, okay? This is an important part of democratic governance. Where there is no involvement equals no commitment. No commitment equals no ownership. No ownership means it's the government's thing versus everybody's thing. It should be by now possible for us to see a dashboard on distribution, both of palliatives, of social investments, of conditional cash transfers, of manufacturer receiving 75 billion, of nano entrepreneurs receiving 125. All these have to be visible. And so greater transparency and accountability, both in one, the contracting, the procurement, the fiscal allocation, the disbursement, and to whom it was disbursed, is what provides the evidence that is required for citizens to see and feel what government is doing. And part of the protest is under information. What citizens don't see and they don't know is happening, they basically discuss as if it does not happen, right? So the burden of proof is on government. Now, government can reduce that burden of proof by identifying across the 36 states of the Federation, CSOs, even media houses like yourself should be available at the points of distribution, asking citizens how they feel about it. Those kinds of open, transparent, accountable reporting mechanisms will ease the pressure. And right now, we need the pressure we need to bring the temperature down in terms of the social gauge of where society is. But that requires us working together. And I think Nigerians are open to working together. We want this to work. But for this to work, there has to be more information coming out as to the how. So, for example, the nano loans go through a portal. When those citizens have been vetted and they are receiving there should be a structure where you see that available. Student loans. When I was a younger man, student loans were those that got it was advertised in the front pages of the newspaper, the school, how much you got, and the university, the amount, the disbursement, the year it was disbursed for. So this is doable. And I think what we need is to work together to create a more open society, a more open government, where an open budget leads to open procurement, open contracting, open disbursements, and therefore where the questions of opportunities for corruption and opportunities for ill business is reduced almost to zero. And as transparency increases, then what we are discussing is how much have we done, how much is left to be done, and how much more must we pool together resources collectively, public sector, private sector, civil society, development sector, to do in the future. But when there is no transparency, right, and when people are guessing what is happening, then that becomes hard to pull off.
So while we wait and hope that we will get more accountability and perhaps a more transparent system with this, what can businesses be doing now? Any hedge for businesses, especially small businesses? Even though, yes, we do hear that the mighty are also falling, but any hedge for any of them?
Look, to be honest, most businesses, if they had the capacity to hedge, they hedged already. Most businesses moved to hedging strategies in the first 6 months, right? And the businesses that can no longer hedge are closing down. And so we need all the support we can get. The NESG is a big believer that we need an economic stimulus, but that stimulus has to be transmitted efficiently and transparently. And then we need to unlock as much resources that are stranded. So we commend the central bank, for example, for its transparent closing of FX forward contracts, to the tune of 5 billion. But there is a 2.4 billion that was devalidated for many reasons, and these are contracts. These are contracting obligations. So what we think, for example, on the additional 2.4 billion, is that some transparency on infractions. What are the infractions these companies have committed? Are they criminal? If they are criminal, let it proceed into an EFCC investigation. If they are administrative in nature and there is a way to go into arbitration, let it be done so that large amounts of money. So you have the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria was pointing to almost 1.5 trillion naira worth of transaction losses from the 2.4 billion FX forwards that has been invalidated, or at least declared not warranted for payment by the central bank due to perceived irregularities. So that, for example, has dragged for too long, right? Because of where we are, because of the macro risk, we need to work together to resolve problems. And I think that, if there are infractions, let's declare criminal infractions and the companies that have done so. If there are administrative infractions that can be resolved through an arbitration process, penalties, let the central bank do so that we clear that backlog and end the history that was tied to these FX backlogs completely and move on. So that is something that we can do tangibly today that makes a difference. Something else we can do tangibly that makes a difference is alignment on tax reforms and reforms that have a taxation nature. We are seeing too many levies and charges uncoordinated. And I think that one of the ways to do it is to sit together. And the president has appointed a very brilliant man in charge of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms to oversee this process of streamlining. But we now need to see some of those recommendations to streamline the number of taxes and the types of taxes. We need to see those recommendations come to the fore to also provide some of this more streamlined efficiencies in tax collection that reduces nuisance taxes and expands the tax net simultaneously, which we think is possible, right? And then you also have to invest in some of the critical issues of security operations. The fact is that the state police debates in Q1 have stalled. There's a need to expand the policing capability of Nigeria. As you can see from the response of the police to the riots and protests across the country, there is still a need to broaden the capability of our capacity to police Nigeria. That's still something to think about. But as you know, has been noted, the wins that the government has seen, in reducing debt financing, the revenue to debt financing ratios, etc., show that fiscal space has been created by the reforms. But here's the problem: macro reforms do not translate quickly to micro outcomes on the plates of Nigerians. So these cushioning interventions are critical in the waiting period, and that's what's dangerous. If in the waiting period of the macro reforms, we do not see the cushioning effect efficiently, effectively, and speedily kick in, then you will expect what Nigerians are saying on the streets, which is it's too hard, it's devastating, we're not seeing the effect. And I think some of these things are not coming together, and there has to be an urgency, a call for emergency to pull it together. The current cabinet will be 1 year old in a few months from its inauguration of the Federal Executive Council. So it's important that the policymakers across board start to ask themselves, where are the nexuses and opportunities for better coordination? And I think that because there are two brilliant coordinating ministers, that they can play a role in beginning to get the economic and social policy actors, Minister Pate and Minister Edu, to march to a more coherent, cohesive, an outcome-driven drumbeat with some tangible outcomes that Nigerians can see. The fact is that we waited too long on the food security response, and that's why we're not able to use 2024 as a year to calibrate for productivity. Hence, the short-term measures in zero tariff on critical staples for the short term. But the fact is that we must be back to 24 to 34 million hectares of cultivated land. The Nigerian National Development Medium-Term Plan 2024 on to 2025 puts a baseline target on cultivated land rate at 34 million to feed Nigeria. So we are under cultivating land currently for the size of our food supply demand, and to close that, all hands needs to be on deck. And so the short-term food, what we call the hunger response measure, which is welcome, and like I said, which needs transparency in its transmission, still needs the agriculture and food systems delivery response, which is still higher levels of cultivation rate, higher levels of fertilization rate, to at least match the 250 kilogram to 370 kilogram of fertilizer per hectare of land, as is stipulated within our own soil security reports and analysis, and use that to drive the crops we need to become bankable in. And the urgency is now. So one of these measures does not take away the need for the other. They are both mutually inclusive, and that needs to be done now. Nigeria is blessed with some unique conditions. We have 8 agroecological zones. The 8 agroecological zones guarantee that Nigeria can plant food all year, depending on which parts of the country. In fact, in some parts of the country, you can have 3 seasons of planting, depending on what you plant in those regions. So we need a more robust approach, and this approach must bring the 36 states to the table. One of the conversations the NESG has started with some of the subnationals that have the highest potential for agroecological potential is how much cultivated land have you done this year? What are you planting, right?
Yeah.
And then how do you scale that? Another thing we must do is open the window that smallholder farming may not be sufficient any longer. And so maybe it's time to bring industrial scale farmers to do 1 million hectares of land, etc. But for that, states need to aggregate the land banks to be that big and attract investments into that. And that has to start now also. So these are some of the conversations we're engaging in, because we think that if you look at the structure of headline inflation, the composite 40% that comes from food points to work that we can close the gap on through some of these structural changes and really make a difference in what Nigerians feel in the food basket.
All right, Dr. Adeloju. Obviously, the NESG is having great conversation there, but as you have also noted, there's the need for the coordination among agencies, ministries, public, private sector, and giving food security head-on attention. Well, thank you so much. Well, certainly we'll follow up on some of this conversation that you have brought up today. Thank you for sharing them with us.
Thank you, Ini, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.